Yeah, so I really like to localize my my presentations, so I thought I would dress like a native Paulista here. Uh, I can say with absolute authority that if you ever need your luggage lost, just go to Rome Airlines. Let's see. Oh, sweet. Oh, you can't see this, but it crashed here. Just a second. Reopen. This is exactly the way you want to start off a presentation. I feel like I'm announcing a new version of Windows. And we're back. Hey, is that right? There we go. Actually, that's the wrong presentation, I think. Can we start over? No, kidding. We'll do the main one here. There we go. All right. There we go. Okay. So I just wanted to start off. Here's my information. You can always reach me here on Twitter, via email. I actually do have an eBay email address, but as you may know, that will be changing at some point in the near future. Also a little Facebook page to, if any of you do that. Some places it's interesting to connect with different people around the world, like in Vietnam, for example. Facebook is really the way you keep in touch. So I did want to include this, type this on the way here, beautiful Alitalia flight from Rome. So, yep, this gives me the chance. I've actually always wanted to do a real serious grown-up presentation in flip-flops and shorts. I can't wait for the marketing team to actually see how I'm dressed when the pictures come out. You'll see down at the bottom, too, if you want to start throwing things out there on Twitter, it's actually really cool for other people to be able to follow along online. I was trying to think, like, what powerful statement can I make about Magento 2? And it occurred to me that you should start preparing. You actually should have started preparing a little while ago because it's close. It's really close. It's coming in November. Magento 2 will be released in November. Okay. We don't exactly expect everyone to run out and re-platform their e-commerce stores in November. I would actually recommend against it. You may, if you're a merchant and you're thinking about it, please think more about it. And if you're a developer, we know some of your merchants will ask. They will ask. They will want to go straight away. I would encourage them to make it through that great American cultural export of Black Friday and Cyber Monday. Maybe then talk about re-platforming. And it's been quite a journey to get here. So those of you who don't know, who may be newer to Magento, Magento 2 project was actually announced in 2010 by a guy who doesn't even work for us anymore. Our esteemed former CTO, Yoav Kuttner. Actually, I think it may have even been at the first Meet Magento Brazil that he talked about it. But through a series of corporate shenanigans, good luck with that translation. Just make something up. I won't know it anyway. We actually at Imagine last year, we said, hey, we've been talking about Magento 2 for a long time, but here's a timeline, and this is when you can expect it. And everyone was kind of like, yeah, we've heard this before, but we actually hit every single milestone that we promised, and that includes getting Magento 2 out in the fourth quarter. It's a big deal when you go from one major version, like Magento 1, to another major version, Magento 2. By definition, or any sensible definition of software, Magento 2, or any major version change, is designed so that you can break backwards compatibility, right? And this is important because Magento 1, it's like 8 years old. Things in the development world, things in the world of online commerce, customers, all of this stuff has changed quite a lot in the last 8 years. Think about how you were doing online shopping 8 years ago. Think about how, if you're a developer, think about how you were developing 8 years ago. It's quite a lot has happened since then. And Magento was ahead of its time and kind of outside of the way that things had been done up to that point. But eventually, markets move, expectations change, and it comes time to grow up and make the changes that you need to make to stay ahead of all the trends that are here now and that are going to be here in the next couple of years. And when we set about looking at Magento and how we could bring it into a more modern state, we set on some goals. And just so you know, these goals don't necessarily come from the marketing team. This is what I actually see when I'm looking at Magento, Magento 2 now. An improved admin experience. I actually it's funny, I actually made these slides that you'll see kind of following up, and I said, you know what? We actually just had, I was in Romania yesterday, and we, Marius Strageru is one of our great community developers, and he did a demo creating like a new blog posting mechanism inside of a Magento 2 instance, and he actually was able to do a lot of stuff with the menu. From a programming standpoint, it's much easier to work with. Configuring grids, you can actually slide grids around and so forth. If I were any good at my job, I probably would have just opened up the demo. The fine folks over at Nexus, thank you for sponsoring, do have an online demo of Magento 2, and I suggest you go through and check it out. The admin performance, admin look and feel, much better. Actually, I should ask, how many people in here are merchants? Yeah, I'll wait for the translation. Okay. So this is the business side, right? This is the business side of what this means for you. Directly working in the Magento admin and Magento 2, much more intuitive. We spent a lot of time doing user research and finding out what the pain points were with Magento 1. We didn't want to repeat those mistakes in Magento 2. So another thing that happened that was really interesting for me was if you go through and you look at how we develop software. So we just use a project management system and we track all sorts of things. But for a lot of these things in the admin, one of the things that we know from Magento 1 was that the admin not performing quickly is a very frustrating experience. You're just trying to do your job. You don't want to feel the friction of whatever application you've chosen. So we have interesting what we call acceptance criteria, and in our for an example is for a store running 1 million SKUs. The grid, any kind of filtering in the grid on a specific set of hardware, that grid had to update in less than 2 seconds. So if you're doing filtering, that had to be snappy with a relatively huge catalog. So this is the kind of work that we did behind the scenes. We also know that a lot of admin users are trying to do things not from a desktop, not from an actual keyboard. So we wanted to make sure that this stuff would work on touchpads, because if maybe you're out in your warehouse, you're walking around, or you're walking from desk to desk and you want to do some admin tasks, you can do that much more easily in 2 than you could in 1. In general, we wanted to make sure that Magento 2 was performant. I mean, if you look at it's a bad story to say, hey, we've got a whole new version of our software and it's way slower than the first one. We knew we couldn't do that, so we spent a lot of time. A good chunk of our engineering time in the last year has gone into optimizing a lot of the stuff underneath. So you can kind of tell I made a little bit of a jump from the admin user side kind of to the underpinning side. But the experience is what matters there, because your customers are going to get a faster a faster experience. You as an admin will get a faster experience. And we have a performance benchmarking toolkit that is actually, it's freely available. It's on GitHub, where we also have the Magento 2 code base, so that people, when we put out benchmarks and we say, here's what Magento 2 can do, we want you to be able to repeat those. Don't ever trust benchmarks that you can't verify for yourself. Another thing is that we decided that performance will always be a core feature. Now what that means is, for example, in Magento 2 with Community Edition and Enterprise Edition, something that is performance related will always go into the core. For example, Magento 2 full page cache is part of the core. Anything dealing with scalability, that goes in Enterprise. And the distinction, I think, is a good one to make. Because if you're operating at some kind of significant scale, millions of customers, millions of SKUs, millions of orders, hopefully, that by definition is an enterprise pursuit. Another thing that we know is that it's rare that your commerce application is installed in a vacuum, in a perfect self-contained little unit. No, there's a Gartner study that they did a big survey of a representative sample of e-commerce stores, and they found that the average was about 14 integrations. 14. And they actually came across one that was 450 external integrations. I don't know if that was actually a wise decision on the part of the enterprise business, but what we did want to make sure was that as an application, it's easier to work with other systems. I'll get into more detail in my talk this afternoon, which is a little bit more developer focused. What can I say about the business side of this? Essentially, as a business owner, you're going to, you should expect that your developers, whether you're working with an agency or you have in-house developers, they're going to have an easier time. Building and maintaining integration health, right? So interfacing with other systems becomes something that is much more easily managed, even through upgrade of the core software. Now, on a customization standpoint, because one of the things that we know is that commerce is never, ever, ever a one-size-fits-all thing. And Magento is incredibly flexible. Magento 1 was incredibly flexible, so is Magento 2. The ability for many small merchants to install and use Magento and tailor it to their liking without having to do actual code level customization. Magento fits in a lot of places, but very often, your business processes, your business itself needs some kind of customization with how this stuff works. It makes your life easier, or it may just be an absolute necessity. So Magento 2 becomes even, we learned a lot from how people customize Magento 1, and we made it much more easy to customize and easier to maintain. It's not just about building that initial feature or modifying something in the core when you do it. You also want it to not mess things up going forward. And so we did a lot of work actually with our expert consulting group to figure out what kind of development effort is involved, to figure out what kind of time they need. And we're glad to see that after a couple of first attempts at building modules in Magento 2, the development time was actually substantially lowered. And through some other programmatic details that I'm not going to go into, it's much easier to handle version changes over time. I may not have done a very good job of introducing myself, by the way. My experience is from development. I was a Magento developer and developer trainer for 6 years before I joined the company last year. So when I'm speaking about these things, I really am speaking from the standpoint of someone who actually has to sit in the chair and do this work, not someone who gets paid to fly to Brazil and talk to you about how wonderful Magento 2 is. I don't think I'd be very good at my job if I couldn't stand up here and say that you know, having worked in the education department on Magento 2 training, having actually been in the code, it really is. It's much more enjoyable to work with. Let's see. Sorry. So that kind of leads me into upgrades. Magento 2 or Magento 1 was always an interesting beast to upgrade. And maybe that's because there was poor development. Maybe that's because there were poor extensions involved that made it hard to go from version to version. But what we've done with Magento 2 is decided that as we pull things in, so we're going to do quarterly releases. So Magento 2 is out in November. Magento 2.1, which will be a feature release, will come out in first quarter of next year. Magento 2.2 will come out second quarter of next year, and so on. So you'll have this regular release cycle when you can look forward to new features. Now, one of the important things that we have to do is also tell you what we're building. And so as we pull things sort of from our big bucket of like, hey, we want to do this stuff, when we pull those things in, we'll actually add that to a product roadmap. So you can expect the product roadmap to be released after Magento 2 is released, so that you'll know what features we're working on. Just because we're going to do quarterly feature releases doesn't mean we won't have updates in between. So we're going to constantly update the platform. And the platform itself, actually, this is for the developers. So store owners, you can cover your ears. For the platform, we actually have a different numbering system, right? So that's actually going to start at version 100, just so there's no confusion. But we actually are using something called semantic versioning, so that you'll know if there are any kind of significant changes to the API, right? And so you'll have access to this stuff. We'll always have it on GitHub for you to check out and update. Now, you know, this stuff on its own, you can take the ear covers off now. This on its own doesn't fix anything, right? We have to have some other stuff involved. So one of the things that we've done with Magento 2 is we've built testing into the core. So testing is something that developers do to know whether a system is still functioning correctly, whether it's just been sitting there and somehow breaks, which, trust me, it happens, and then whether when they write new code or when they pull in a new extension, that everything still works. So not only did we build an architecture for this, but we're also building developer terminology, unit tests, functional tests, and integration tests. So at its core, Magento 2 is a tested product. And that means that going forward, and this is very important, so I'm going to get close to the edge here to create some drama. Testing in Magento 2 is absolutely essential. If you write code for Magento 2 and you don't write test coverage, it's incomplete code. That's to the developers. Hi, I'm back. To the merchants, you should always insist on test coverage. You don't need to know what it means. You just need to know that it's there. It's what keeps your store from breaking whenever you ask developers to do stuff for you. So you can quote me on it. I have a slide in my presentation this afternoon if you want to take a picture. But in Magento 2, untested code is incomplete code. This is very important. That means we all have to level up. How many developers in here are already doing testing in their development cycle? Yeah, that's typical. It should be everyone's hand. I mean, we're not building embedded software in like life-saving machines, but when we break stuff, we usually find out because a merchant says, my customers can't check out. and customer-driven testing is just never a good option. It's very expensive. One of the really refreshing things. Who here started working with Magento like 2007, 2008? Anyone? Couple hands? Awesome. The old timers. They've seen some things. We actually have Magento U classes already done for Magento 2. We also have this really awesome thing called documentation. Like, it's actually there. We have tech writers on staff, and they actually have been writing this documentation as we've been building Magento 2. It's far from complete. There's tons of stuff to write, but it's there. Like, that, the important thing is it's there, it has a place. In fact, our technical writing staff, they actually taught themselves GitHub. They taught themselves how to use GitHub. And they put all of our documentation on GitHub, so you can actually, if you go to that site and start clicking through the different help documents, you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, edit this page on GitHub. So you can actually add or change things, and you just, like you would do normally if you're a developer, just fork the repository, create a pull request, and you will forever be lauded and thanked by your fellow developers. So I get asked about this a lot. I'm part of the certification creation team, created the certifications for Magento 1. I worked on the developer certification and the solution specialist certification. Magento 2 certification will come, this is a probably, it probably will be there sometime next year. We do this intentionally. We're not going to write a certification test until we see how people are using Magento 2, right? We want to see how people customize things. We want to see where mistakes are made. Certification in the Magento world is meant to test a working, like, applied knowledge of the Magento code base. So that's why we're going to do certification later in the year after Magento 2 sites start popping up. But I wanted to stress, too, that from the beginning, we are collaborating with the community. So back in December, when we started the developer beta, we also changed how we have our code provided online so that our great worldwide developer community could actually contribute to the product. So Magento 2 was actually built in part by our community, with contributions from them. There have been thousands of interactions with them, directly with the core team, and several pull requests, basically, code that they've sent us that makes Magento 2 a much better product. I can say that fundamentally, Magento 2 is a much, much better project because of this. And the same will be true with the documentation. And I just want to stress that these are some of the things that were missing in the early days of Magento, like Magento 1. It's always a bit of a question mark when you go to a land. I wish I spoke Portuguese, but really it's very good for all of us that I'm not trying to. It wouldn't go well. I'd probably say something offensive. I said one thing in Vietnamese when I was in Vietnam, and it turns out I pronounced it incorrectly and used slang for a certain profession. Contextually, they were very kind. They forgave me, but I would like to ask, because Magento 2, this is really serious, right? I mean, we're going Magento 1, Magento 2. It's an interesting time. So I want to ask what you think, and if you speak Portuguese and not English, I mean, please don't let that hold you back. I would just say someone can translate for you and ask the question, or if you prefer, I'll be here all day, because Carlos told me I had to be here all day. But I'll be here all day, and I'm more than happy to take questions as well outside. So who's got a question? So there goes the hands. Okay, yes, please. I can hear you, and I'll repeat your question. Yeah, so the question was going forward with Magento 2. So Magento has two versions right now, Enterprise and Community Edition. Now, Enterprise in Magento 1 is a set of modules that sits on top of essentially the community product. It's the same thing going forward. There are also going to be some interesting additions to the family. So we will have this on launch day. There will be Magento 2 CE, Magento 2 EE. We're also working on a business-to-business product as well. So something that, because business-to-business commerce is anyone that's built that with Magento, and I've worked on some of this myself, a whole different set of needs. Like there's different functionality that there's different functionality that applies. I'm back. All right. There's different functionality that exists between two businesses that doesn't exist in a business-to-customer experience. Also, some of the scale of data, the kinds of things that get sort of abused in that world, very different. So we will be adding these kinds of don't know what the proper word for it is, but basically it's sort of like a cousin to the family. Does that answer the question for you? Okay. And then there was another question somewhere over here. Someone had a hand, or maybe they were just having a spasm. I don't know. Anyone? Yes, there we go. Yep. Because maybe Carlos. Yeah, can you help with the translation?
Bom, é português, tá? Vocês vão continuar usando o Zend Framework como estrutura e para a criação de módulos ainda vão continuar utilizando o XML?
I heard Zen Framework. Yeah. So I'm going to guess that it was a question involving Zen Framework. And don't translate it to German. My German's not that good either.
You ask if you're still using Zen Framework as the basis and then XML as the configuration.
This is another first. I can hear you. You have a great voice. Yeah, Carlos got me hooked up. I straight up look like I'm about to board a plane for Rio. I think so. It was really nice talking to you, though. So the question is, about Zen Framework and are we using it? So we thought Zen Framework 1 was a little lonely in Magento 2, so we added Zen Framework 2 and Symfony. So we use each of these things for different purposes, right? Because so this is the great thing about modernizing Magento. So again, store owners, sorry, going to get a little technical here. We're using Composer, and we're following PHP standard recommendations, the PSRs, which means that we can actually work with all sorts of other packages out there. See, it's this really interesting thing that happens in the PHP open source world. We have people who build really cool things, and they build them in a standard way, and if we make our stuff in a standard way, we can use their stuff, which is great. That's the whole beauty behind extensions and things like that, is it's someone else's work that works that's going to probably be updated over time. Developers should always bristle at the thought of building something that's already been built. Now, we love to write stuff that's already been built, but in our case, we're using some of the stuff that wasn't enough benefit to update it from Zen Framework 1 to Zen Framework 2. So that stuff stayed. So things like down at the database level, for example. Zen Framework 2 components we used when we could, and the Symfony components we're actually only using right now for our new command line tool, which, if you've ever used Mage Run, is very similar to that. And I think that's about it. But again, I'll actually go into more detail. And I actually just remembered, I didn't even mention Magento Connect. Did I just leave it out of my slides entirely? I did. So maybe marketing is always on me to give them my presentations. But also we have, with the launch of Magento 2, we have a new Magento Connect, which is an app store model. So we're actually doing rev share. We actually will review every single piece of code that comes into that thing, and you know that it's going to be good, not someone else's stolen extension. And some of these things will even be go through extensive verification and receive special badging.
Em português, bom dia. No Magento 1.
Go.
No Magento 1, as atualizações, as de versão, como você disse, elas saíam de tempos em tempos, não tão rápido como você passou aqui, que a cada quarto, né, a cada 3 meses vão sair novas versões. O processo de atualização da plataforma, da versão 2.0 para 2.1, vai existir algum tipo de ferramenta dentro da plataforma, ou nós vamos fazer isso através de Git? E qual o risco de quebrar a loja? A gente vai ficar tranquilo, nós vamos ter... Porque hoje em dia no 1, você atualizar de versão 1.7 para 1.9, aconteciam muitos problemas. 1.8 saiu com muito problema também. E como que isso está sendo tratado para facilitar a vida nossa dos desenvolvedores?
So we know it's not a very good story. When people, I'm going to assume everyone heard what he said. I can't really repeat it. No, no. In English, so basically you're just saying, hey, it was a real pain to go from 1.7 to 1.8 or to 1.9. Occasionally we had some mistakes. Oops, sorry. 1.8 was a great example of that. Right, so part of what we know going forward, again, a big part of it resolves back to tests. So the testing is a way to do, you can do a dry run externally. It's very much like now where you can, you have the ability to update via Composer, you have the ability to update the code via Git. You can always do a manual file swap if you want, but I think in the future most people will be doing some kind of code management because there's so many different things involved. But the ability to actually run your tests, and to be honest, I think continuous integration will become a norm. It should be a norm in all e-commerce anyway, but I think it will be a norm going forward. Also we have eliminated pretty much eliminated any hard-coded dependencies. We do have certain modules do rely on others, but we do have some tooling around that. There's actually in the command line tool you can actually check for dependencies, circular dependencies, etc. See what else. Also, I think the fact that we have the code live on GitHub, that kind of exposure to all these people out there who like to tinker with stuff as we put it out there, we're getting much faster feedback. I mean, do I think we'll never make a mistake? Absolutely not. If you can find a developer who writes bug-free software, I would just actually fire them because they're not they're lying to you, right? So, but faster feedback, tests that will catch a lot of problems. This is going to be the key for going forward. Also, I missed maybe a first part. The thing wasn't working, but to get from Magento 1 to Magento 2, we actually do have a tool. It's not a direct upgrade, but we do have a tool that will help with data. And we also have some information coming out because the themes will need to be rebuilt, but we have some information coming out on that. And I think, thank you, by the way, for asking questions, especially in Portuguese. It occurred to me that I should always make sure people feel good to ask questions. And like I said, I'll be outside later if you want to ask me questions in person. And again, please don't let the language barrier, my inability to learn Portuguese, please bring a friend over and we can have a good 3-person discussion. Thank you very much. I want to again thank sponsors, thank Carlos and team for putting this on. It's really cool that this kind of thing can happen here in Brazil. And I would say go out, learn, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.